Hi, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. We're just going to let a few last people walk in. But welcome. My name is Ashima Sukhdev, and I lead the Governments and Cities program at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Welcome to this session on circular food systems in cities, which I have the great pleasure of hosting today. So I've just come from a very enthralling weekend in Tokyo, and while I work in the city space day to day, I think this weekend really reminded me of the potential of great cities. Cities are major centers of economic activity, of knowledge, of innovation, with 85% of global GDP being generated in cities, and more than half the world's population living in them. On the flip side, of course, cities are also on the front line when it comes to the negative impacts of the linear take, make, dispose economy. 75% of natural resources are consumed within cities. More than 50% of global waste is produced in cities, and there's significant greenhouse gas emissions that are accounted for by cities. When it comes to food, our cities are black holes. They attract nutrients and food and throw away more than 600 million tons of organics every year. We at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are increasingly working with cities to explore what the potential of the circular economy can be. So what happens when you apply circular economy principles to urban systems like the built environment, like mobility, like products and consumables, and of course, like food systems? And that's what we're here to talk about today, cities and food. How can we apply the circular economy principles to food systems in cities, and what can we find when we do that? So if we do want to move towards more regenerative food systems in cities, I think there's really three key questions that we're going to be asking here in this session today. And I have a fantastic lineup of speakers that will help me do that. The first is, what is the role of cities in redesigning food systems? So a lot of the conversation to date has been focused on agriculture and the rural presence of agriculture. And we're really going to ask today, how does this apply to cities? What's the role of cities? Secondly, we heard in the plenary session this afternoon, we're really looking for the best-in-class solutions of circular food systems in cities. So we'll be hearing a lot of those examples as well. And lastly, and most importantly probably, we're also going to be looking to see how we can replicate those solutions across cities and in different countries, and very importantly, scale them as well. So we'll have perspectives of people speaking from international organizations, people working on the ground on this day-to-day. And so I'd like to welcome our first speaker to start us off, one of the executive officers of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and one of my colleagues, Joss Blériot, who's going to be speaking about urban biocycles and sharing a little bit about our ongoing work on food in cities. So over to you, Joss. Sorry. You can use this one too, Joss.
Let's use the one which is actually turned on. That should be easier for you guys to hear me. Hello, hey, that was finished by the way, konnichiwa. Very glad to be here, very glad to be co-organizing this session as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with our colleagues at CITRA. And as Ash was saying, I'm here to talk to you about circular economy and cities in the urban context, which is really a bit of our latest project, something that is keeping us busy at the foundation, among other things, I was tempted to say, because we tend to have a few things on the hub at the same time, but this one really is one of our big projects at the moment. So I suppose where it comes from is the Urban Biocycles paper that we launched last year was taking a look at the left side of the circular economy butterfly diagram. For those of you who are familiar with this, we have an economy which is divided into two cycles, the biological one and the technical one. And I think it's fair to say that most of the modelization and analysis and figures have been focusing over the past few years mostly on the technical cycle. That is, of course, because it's the easiest one to modelize. It's where the low-hanging fruits are. And the biocycle was something that we've really tried to get to grips with for a number of years. And we really felt like we needed a proper entry point in order to do that. You can't just say, we'll take the biocycle and turn it into something fully circular and see what it yields. It's much too complex. It's an interconnected system. It's probably the mother of all interconnected systems, actually. So the questions that we were asking ourselves after that Urban Biocycles paper, which we released last year, were, what are the issues with the current model? What is food production? What does it look like? What benefits does it bring? What drawbacks does it have? What's the actual linearity in that system? How can we address it? What would a circular economy underpinned food system would look like? And what, in that big equation, role can cities play? Because as Ash reminded us, there are major centers of economic power. There are also centers of accumulation of negative impacts when it comes to air pollution, but also waste generation. And really, we see that disconnect between the food production and the food consumption and what those nutrients are doing. They're sitting somewhere at great cost, and it's very difficult to deal with them. And more importantly, they don't go back to where they should be going back. This project is the third of what we call our systemic initiatives. The first one was the new plastics economy, which we launched in late 2015 with the first report in Davos. And the second one is Make Fashion Circular. The report has been launched, and now we're in the mobilization phase. And for this Cities and the Circular Economy for Food, I have to say, first of all, that we're extremely pleased to have Citra as a partner on board. So this is really the concretization of a collaboration that's been going on for a few years between our organizations. And the report is going to be launched at Davos this year. So what I'm going to do now is give you a bit of a context and tell you what we've been thinking around that problem and our opportunity, rather than really going into full insights disseminations, because we're still in the analysis phase. So I suppose that this diagram is very self-explanatory. It's the illustration of our linear model, which applies to the industrial system as well as the food production system. So it's very take, make, and dispose. It's very extractive. There are a lot of waste at every stage of the production and consumption process. And of course, that industrial revolution and the green revolution of the food system has brought many benefits and lifted billions out of hunger and poverty, but at the same time generated a lot of negative impacts. We can talk about soil degradation, and the UN, for instance, has calculated that globally it costs about 40 billion of economic losses per year, and that figure, I'm afraid, is already a bit dated, so chances are that it's worse than that today as we speak. Both the systems and the individual pay a very heavy price of that system in terms of obesity and malnutrition, which paradoxically happen at the same time and keep on rising, but also when it comes to exposure to pesticides, soil degradation, and there's a very big CO2 price as well to the system as we know it today. By 2050, if nothing changes, 2/3 of the carbon budget that we can afford in order to remain under the 2 degrees scenario will be eaten up by food production systems. Now, if I go back to another systemic initiative that we have, the one on plastic, which I mentioned, this, by 2050, plastics could eat up 15% of the carbon budget. So if we add plastics and food production alone, we're already at 75%. There's no room to maneuver anymore. If we add to that air pollution, antimicrobial resistance, and a host of other associated and quite frightening impacts, we see that there's potential to do it much better than we do. At the moment, the linearity of the system, as we've seen, is quite damaging. But what we have to remind ourselves is that with the food production systems, we're dealing with living systems. And if you've heard that sentence taken from Cradle to Cradle, which says that waste equals food, well, it's never truer than in this specific context. Because nutrients are designed to go back to the soil, and that's the way the regenerative notion and aspect of the circular economy really happens at scale. Here, we really have the potential not to simply stick to doing less bad, but to build natural capital, which is the third pillar of the circular economy. Build natural capital rather than generate revenue by depleting stocks. The linear model brings imbalances, nutrient runoff, we can see that absolutely everywhere, eutrophication, you name it. The question is, how do we move from this current state of affairs to a more regenerative one? And maybe the cities are an underestimated point of entry for that. As Ashima was saying, 85% of global GDP is generated in cities. By 2050, 70% of the world's population is going to live in cities. And cities can directly have an impact on valorizing the food waste, for instance. Of course, reduction is the first principle when it comes to food waste, but there's always going to be residual food waste. Currently, it's untapped. It's dealt with with a very high cost associated with it. And cities also are at the confluence of the co-location of food system influencers, retailers, brands, big markets, consumers, waste management authorities as well. Urban markets are also very receptive to innovation, and that should be something that we look to tap in the future. There are three main levers that cities can activate. Food production. Well, 40% of the world's cropland exists within a 25-mile radius around cities, which is massively underexploited at the moment. And it's estimated that 80% of the food that people eat could actually be sourced within 50 miles of their place of residence. That, of course, assumes certain substitution in the current baskets. And if you live in London, it's difficult to imagine that you are going to be able to source your pineapples from the green belt. But it is still possible to have a healthy, nutritious diet which is produced around the place of residence in cities. The second lever is really about waste and byproduct valorization. The feedstock is there. Cities do consume aggregate nutrients which sit idle and do nothing, and at the end are very difficult to deal with. And that is really where the reconnection between peri-urban and urban could be made. At the moment, those nutrients don't go back to the soil as they should, but if the infrastructure is right and if the processes are in place in order for those nutrients to go back to where they should be, then there's a massive potential. And of course, innovations play a role as well. There are a lot of important steps that cities can take in order to help that innovation and support it, either by public procurement, but also by really tapping into the potential of the existing logistics, the existing retailers and producers network that are embedded in cities. Now, if we look at a few case studies, first of all from Finland, Soil Food does exactly that. It takes urban and industrial waste streams and turns them into supplements for soil restoration. These are the figures that they have been able to produce for 2017, so quite impressive for a very young organization which is growing. And the idea here is to say we're closing those nutrient loops by using the potential that is currently untapped and exists at a cost. Second example is AgriProtein, South African company, which takes, again, organic waste, mostly from urban centers, and turns that into feed for pigs and poultry. Because at the moment, fish feed is mainly made of fish. So we deplete further the fish stocks by feeding that to fish that we farm, which shows a bit of the absurdity of the system. By the way, the for pigs specifically, it's a bit different. And in Japan, there has been that tradition of feeding waste food from the human consumption side to the pigs, which is something that, unfortunately, a lot of Western markets, and especially in Europe, are not doing anymore due to health and safety restrictions, which have a lot of good intentions, but actually bypass a lot of potential. So props to Japan for keeping with that circular model of doing things. Now, another one is looking at using waste products from spent grain from breweries and turning that into something which can actually be very useful in terms of supplements and also high protein models of having those drinks, and that company is taking products which usually are burnt or turned into fish feed, as we've seen in our second report, and bringing to markets, typically urban markets, which are open to innovation and who like that novelty, to have that new outlet and new revenue stream. In terms of packaging, we might have to see what they can do with that plastic, by the way, but that's a side story. Finally, just to say, we're basing our research on the relationship with the case study cities, Brussels, Guelph in Canada, Porto, and Sao Paulo. Brussels is currently sourcing about 30% of its fruit and veg in the peri-urban environment. Guelph has been selected as a finalist in the smart cities, and one of their work streams is specifically on food, and the idea to really have 50 case studies of businesses that are working in regeneration and in circular economy food production. Porto has been looking at a circular economy strategy for the city, which not only focuses on food, but also has a very strong stream when it comes to valorizing organic waste. And Sao Paulo as well, which has a very extensive network of municipal markets and currently does not do much with the byproducts of those markets and all the waste that is generated. So the aim is to have 15 initiatives collecting organic waste and feeding that to municipality compost facilities or AD to create biogas. Now, the next steps for our project is really looking at the mobilization phase. So we're going to, as I said in the beginning, really look at the deep dives and release the numbers at Davos in January next year, 2019. And once we've done that, the idea is really to mobilize along the value chain by looking at taking city authorities, retailers, brand, food innovators, and creating the conditions for an urban system focused on circular economy underpinning food systems, and take that to scale and really say, okay, so once we've drawn those lessons, once we have the opportunity quantified, can we provide cities that would like to replicate that with open source tools? How can we go further, and how can we create that dynamic to make sure that we move from proof of concept to proof of scale and really get the economy to move in cities for food specifically towards circular regenerative models. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joss. It's fantastic to hear of that ambition, and we're looking forward to continuing to follow the work. So I'd like to now welcome our next speaker, who is Mr. Kazuo Fukuyama. He is the Director General of Resources and Waste Recycling Bureau for the city of Yokohama, and is going to be sharing his insights on what circular food systems look like in this city. So I welcome you up onto the stage. Thank you so much for having us in this beautiful city. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kazuo Fukuyama, Director General of the Resources and Waste Recycling Bureau, Yokohama City. Today, I will talk about the city of Yokohama's initiatives concerning the theme of food circulation systems in cities. To begin with, I will give you a short outline of our city. The city of Yokohama first opened its port around 160 years ago. Since then, it has developed as an international port city. Located 30 kilometers from Tokyo, the capital of Japan, it is Japan's largest municipality with their current population of 3.74 million people. Next, I will talk a little about waste treatment in Japan. Under Japanese law, waste is broadly classified into two types: general waste and industrial waste. By law, the obligation for treating industrial waste resides with the businesses who generated the waste. Meanwhile, municipalities are responsible for treating general waste. As such, please bear in mind that the city of Yokohama's initiatives that I will introduce today are largely related to general waste. This graph shows transitions in the population of Yokohama and the total volume of waste. Following the Second World War, Japan underwent major development due to a period of rapid economic growth. This, however, came at the expense of serious waste issues. Between the years of 1960 and 2000, Yokohama's population increased by 2.5 times, and the total volume of waste increased by 16 times. In order to solve this problem, the city of Yokohama created a system for waste management and has taken an active stance in promoting recycling. As you can see, although the city's population has continued to grow since the year 2000, the total volume of waste has continued to decrease. This shows the flow of the city of Yokohama's waste treatment operations. Households sort waste into burnable waste, non-burnable waste, and recyclable resources. Burnable waste is sent to an incineration plant. The waste burned at the incineration plants turns to ash, which is buried at the final disposal site. Resources are recycled following intermediate processing. Here in Yokohama, we generate around 1.21 million tons of waste on an annual basis. The ratio of vulnerable waste and resources is approximately 7:3. Vulnerable waste can be reduced to 1/7 through incineration. As a result, the volume of waste buried at the final disposal site is 1/10 of the generated volume. Here in the city of Yokohama, we sort waste generated by households into 10 categories and 15 items. Among these, I will introduce the composition of vulnerable waste. 33.8% of vulnerable waste is kitchen waste. Of this, 58%, around 111,000 tons, was food waste. That was thrown away despite still being edible. In light of this, the city made it a priority to reduce the amount of food waste with the goal of reducing the amount of generated food waste by at least 20% by 2021. This target is in line with the goal set out in the SDGs of reducing food waste by 50% by 2030. First, I will talk about public awareness activities and environmental education for citizens aimed at reducing food waste. Specifically, this includes holding environmental education sessions and symposiums, distributing recipes for using up ingredients, promoting food banks and food drives, disseminating soil mixture methods, etc. Next, I will talk about initiatives we conducted in collaboration with businesses. We are calling on restaurants and the other food providers to register under a special scheme called 食べきり協力店, in which they pledge to take such measures as introducing menus for people who want smaller portions or making arrangements for those who wish to take leftovers home with them. To date, around 810 stores have registered for this scheme. In addition, we have cooperated with the supermarkets and other stores to conduct awareness-raising activities in front of and inside stores. Furthermore, we are generating wider awareness by presenting awards to those business operations who take a proactive stance towards limiting the amount of waste they generate and recycling resources, etc. For your reference, I would also like to mention how businesses within the city of Yokohama have also been making a range of efforts to promote food circulation systems. One such example is the food recycling loop, in which leftovers generated by food